The wind moved low and restless across the plains, carrying with it a whistle that could unsettle even the most hardened soul. A man sat hunched on the porch of a weather-worn cabin, his elbows balanced on his knees, a chipped tin cup clasped in his hand. The drink inside was cold, forgotten hours ago, but he gripped it as though it tethered him to the earth. His name, if anyone had been near enough to call it, was John Avery, though the silence of the frontier had almost stripped him of that identity. Years alone had a way of reducing a man to shadows and routines. The cabin behind him leaned slightly to the left, its roof patched with mismatched shingles, the logs darkened by rain and age. A single corral sat half-collapsed beside it, the posts warped and bent, and the well, dug by his own hands, waited with a bucket tied to fraying rope. John lived among these ruins like a ghost that refused to depart. The loneliness was not loud. It was steady, relentless, as constant as the dust that coated his boots. Each morning began the same. He rose before the sun crested the ridges, chopped wood with deliberate strokes, fed the horse he rarely rode, and tended to a garden that produced little more than stubborn roots and bitter greens. There was food enough to survive, but not to thrive. At night, when the coyotes howled and the fire cracked low, he spoke to no one. Once he had spoken to his wife, Clara, and their daughter, Emily, until fever carried them both away one cruel winter. After that, words felt like waste. Silence shewed to the dead, and John felt closer to them than to the living. The land mirrored his grief. The prairie stretched wide and barren, the grass brittle under the summer sun, the soil cracked like a parched throat. Storms swept through often, lashing the earth with rain and wind, only to vanish into blue skies that mocked the suffering below. Life here demanded resilience, but John had long since lost the will to demand anything of himself. He endured, and endurance was not the same as living. That afternoon, the horizon trembled with heat. John sat sharpening a hunting knife, the rhythm of steel on stone marking time, when the faintest sound touched his ears. At first he dismissed it as a trick of the wind, but it came again, steady, deliberate, growing closer. Hoofbeats. He rose, squinting into the distance. Two shapes moved slowly toward him, wavering in the glare of sunlight. His hand tightened on the knife. Visitors were rare in this part of the territory, and when they came, they seldom meant kindness. As the riders drew nearer, the details sharpened. They were women, both astride weary horses, their clothes laid against the dust, faces half covered by claws knotted across their mouths. Strangers, foreign to these plains. The first carried herself upright, guarded, her dark eyes scanning the land as though expecting danger at every turn. The second leaned forward slightly, her shoulders slumped with fatigue, though her gaze lifted now and then with quiet hope. They moved as one, bound together by purpose and perhaps by blood, though their likeness was not strong enough to mark them as sisters. John's pulse quickened. He had not spoken to another soul in months, not since a trader passed through with supplies. To see not one, but two strangers riding into his solitude felt almost like an intrusion on sacred ground. He stood rooted, knife at his side, as the horses slowed and the women dismounted. The first spoke, her accent distinct, her voice carrying both caution and resolve. "We seek shelter, just for a night." John did not answer at once. His eyes flicked to the horizon, searching for others who might follow. Bandits use such tricks. Send someone harmless ahead, lure a fool into lowering his guard. But the women's mounts were thin, their saddlebags nearly empty, and exhaustion weighed on their movements. If this was deception, it was masterfully cruel. "Why here?" His voice rasped, unused, startling even to his own ears. "There was smoke," the second woman said softly, her tone warmer, more pleading. "We hoped someone kind might live here." Kind. The word hung between them like a memory half-remembered. Once, perhaps, kindness had lived here. Now only John remained. He studied them in silence, wrestling with suspicion and something deeper, an ache he thought buried. At last he gestured toward the cabin. One night, no longer. Relief flashed across the younger woman's face. She dipped her head in gratitude, while the elder gave a curt nod, her guard unbroken. They led their horses to the corral, tying them with practiced ease, then followed him inside. The cabin greeted them with shadows and stale air. John had kept it clean enough, but the absence of voices, of laughter, weighed heavier than dust. The women set down their packs, exchanging a look that spoke of weariness beyond the day's journey. John busied himself at the hearth, stoking embers into flame, placing a pot of water to boil. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions. It was the younger woman who broke it. "I am Mai," she said, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "This is Lin." John nodded but did not give his name. He poured water into tin cups and set them before the women. Mai smiled faintly in thanks, her eyes soft but searching, as though trying to measure the man who had given them refuge. Lin, in contrast, kept her gaze sharp, scanning the room, the door, the single window, calculating escape if needed. As the fire warmed the cabin, John caught fragments of their story. They had traveled far, fleeing hardship, though details remained shrouded in silence. Lin's words carried steel, warning him not to press, while Mai's gentleness filled the gaps. They were weary of mistrust, but need had driven them here. John listened without reply, his mind drifting to Clara and Emily. For a moment, Mai's voice overlapped with his daughter's laughter in memory, and he looked away sharply, ashamed of the ghost rising in him. His heart, long caged, stirred against its chains. Outside, dusk settled. The plain shifted from gold to shadow, and the distant cry of wolves drifted on the wind. John stepped onto the porch, scanning the darkening land. Every instinct told him danger would come, as it always did when the world offered him a sliver of peace. He returned inside, bolting the door. Lin caught the motion, her lips pressing thin. "You expect trouble." "Always." His answer carried no boast, only weary certainty. The fire burned low as night deepened. The women settled near the hearth, Mai curling into her blanket, Lin sitting upright with eyes half-closed but alert. John lay on his cot in the corner, staring at the ceiling. The cabin that had been his tomb now breathed with new presence, fragile and unfamiliar. He felt both unsettled and alive in a way he had not for years. Sleep came fitfully. Sometime in the night, he woke to a sound, scratching at the edge of the corral, a whine carried on the wind. He rose silently, taking his rifle from its place by the door. Through the sliver of window he saw shadows moving, too many to count, circling the horses. Wolves! He stepped outside, the night air sharp against his skin. The animals' eyes glowed faintly in the moonlight, their bodies shifting as they tested the boundaries of the fence. John raised the rifle, fired into the air. The crack split the silence, scattering some, but not all. Teeth flashed, low growls rose. He fired again, this time striking close enough to send the pack fleeing into darkness. Behind him, the door creaked. Lin stood there, knife in hand, her expression unshaken. Mai hovered just behind her, eyes wide with fear. "Wolves," John muttered, lowering the rifle. "They'll be back." Lin gave a single nod, then closed the door, her trust in him neither granted nor denied, merely observed. John lingered outside a moment longer, staring into the endless night. He knew this was only the beginning. The world had noticed his solitude, and it would not let him remain untouched. The arrival of these women had shifted something in the stillness of his life. The question now was whether that shift would bring salvation or ruin. And though he told himself it was only one night, deep inside he already sensed the truth. Nothing would ever be the same again. The morning came with a thin mist clinging to the earth, a veil that softened the sharp lines of prairie. John stepped outside before the sun had cleared the horizon, his boots sinking slightly into damp soil, and for the first time in years, he wasn't alone. The women had risen early as well. Lin moved with deliberate precision, tending to their horses, tightening straps, inspecting hooves as though danger might lurk even in the smallest crack. Mai crouched by the well, drawing water with both hands steady despite the weariness etched into her frame. Her breath clouded in the cool air, her eyes lifting every so often to meet John's. A faint smile touched her lips, a quiet acknowledgment of shared labor. He split wood in silence, each swing of the axe a ritual that had once defined the monotony of his days. Now, however, each strike seemed amplified by their presence, as though his strength carried witness again. Mai watched, not with judgment but with curiosity, while Lin remained near the horses, eyes scanning the distance as if the horizon itself might betray them. Breakfast was plain, hardtack softened in hot water, a thin stew of dried beans that Mai coaxed into flavor with herbs from her pack. She stirred with careful grace, the rhythm of her movements calming in a way John found both unsettling and familiar. When she offered him the first bowl, her hand brushed his briefly. A shock of warmth moved through him, sharp enough to make him glance away. He hadn't felt such a thing in years, not since Clara. Lynn noticed, her gaze narrowing. She placed her own bowl down without eating, her voice level. "We are grateful for your shelter, but we cannot linger long. It is not safe for us." John lifted his eyes to her, studying the rigid line of her shoulders. "Safe for anyone." His voice carried no accusation, only weary knowledge. Lynn said nothing, but her silence was answer enough. The days stretched into wake. The women did not sit idle. My mended worn blankets, her nimble fingers drawing neat stitches where John's hands would have left crude patches. Lynn insisted on repairing the corral, lifting heavy beams without complaint. John joined her, the two working side by side beneath a hot sun. Sweat streaked his brow, yet he found a strange steadiness in her presence, as if her vigilance reminded him of duties he had long abandoned. That night, they shared a fire together for the first time. Mai spoke sparingly but revealed pieces of their journey, town that turned them away, faces twisted with suspicion, days spent hiding from men whose anger grew whenever they spoke in their own tongue. Her words fell softly, but each carried weight, and John felt the tight knot of guilt forming in his chest. He had known isolation, but theirs was a harsher exile, one painted not by grief alone but by hostility. Lynn interrupted only once, her tone sharp. "The world does not welcome us. That is why we cannot stay in one place too long." John stared into the fire, listening to the crackle and hiss. "The world doesn't welcome anyone," he said finally. "Not out here." The silence that followed was not hostile but thoughtful, like a bridge half-built. Days folded into one another, each carrying the subtle rhythm of survival. They gathered wild berries when the sun was kind, boiled tough rabbit meat when fortune bent in their favor. Mai hummed quietly while she worked, the tune unfamiliar yet soothing, and John found himself lingering near whenever the sound touched the air. Lynn, though guarded, grew less rigid, her eyes less quick to flash suspicion, though never softening entirely. She carried herself like a shield, and John began to wonder what weight she bore beyond the visible dangers of the land. One evening, as the prairie turned violet under the dying light, John returned from checking snares to find Mai crouched by the porch, her hand cradling a small bird with a broken wing. She looked up as he approached, her expression tender. "It fell," she whispered. "I thought maybe it can still live." John crouched beside her, studying the fragile creature. "Out here," he said gently. "The broken don't last long." Her eyes met his. Steady. Sometimes, if given care, they do. The words pierced deeper than he expected. He looked away, throat tight, and when he rose to his feet, he carried with him the weight of her gaze. That night he lay awake, listening to the faint breathing of the women across the room, wondering if perhaps he, too, was more broken than gone. The fragile peace did not last. It was late afternoon when the first sign of trouble came, dust rising in the distance, not from wind but from riders. John saw them first, the silhouette of 4 men cresting a ridge. Their movements were lazy, unhurried, but there was something deliberate in their approach that made his gut tighten. He called for Lynn, who came at once, her hand on the knife at her belt. "They've seen the smoke," John muttered. "Best we stay inside." But it was too late. The riders closed in, their laughter carrying across the plains, coarse and careless. They pulled up at the corral, eyes raking across the cabin, the women, the man standing before them. "Well now," the tallest of them drawled, his beard scraggly, his teeth bared in a grin. "Ain't this a sight? A lonely rancher keeping foreign company." His companions chuckled, spitting into the date. John's grip tightened on his rifle, though he held it low, barrel aimed at the ground. "Not your concern," he said evenly. The man's grin widened. "Everything out here's my concern. These women yours? Or maybe they're just passing through, needing a little hospitality." His eyes slid toward Mai, lingering with cruel intent. Lynn stepped forward, blade glinting in her hand. Her voice was sharp as steel. "We're not yours." The men laughed again, though unease flickered in their eyes at a defiance. John raised the rifle slowly, his voice steady though his heart pounded. "You'll leave. Now." The standoff stretched, the air thick with the possibility of violence. The leader studied John, then spat into the date, his grin souring. "Not worth it today. But you watch yourself, rancher. Not everyone out here is so patient." With a sharp tug on the reins, he wheeled his horse around, the others following, their laughter fading into distance. Dust settled slowly, but the tension lingered long after. Inside, Ma's hand shook as she poured water into cups, her voice trembling as she whispered, "They'll come back." John set the rifle down, his jaw clenched. "Yes, and next time, they won't just talk." The days that followed carried a weight heavier than before. Every sound beyond the cabin wall stirred unease. Lynn sharpened her blade each night, her eyes fixed on shadows. Ma tried to keep the air lighter, humming softly, coaxing small smiles from John when she could. Yet beneath it all, fear pressed close. John wrestled with more than fear. He felt the old guilt rising again, guilt for the pull he felt toward Ma, for the way his chest tightened when she smiled, for the flicker of warmth her presence sparked in her hollow life. He had buried Clara and Emily with promises to remain faithful to their memory, to let his heart rest where theirs did. Now, every glance of Ma felt like betrayal, every moment of tenderness like treachery. One night he sat alone on the porch, the stars spread vast above him, the rifle resting across his knees. His mind churned with conflict. He longed to close himself off again, to drive them away before the inevitable violence struck. Yet some deeper part of him resisted. He no longer recognized which part of him was stronger, the man who wished to remain a ghost or the one who longed to feel alive again. Ma joined him quietly, her step soft. She sat beside him, folding her hands in her lap. For a long while, neither spoke. Then she said, her voice low, "You carry sorrow." He did not answer. His throat ached too much for words. She turned her face toward him, the starlight catching her features. But sorrow is not the same as death. So long as you breathe, you can choose what to do with it. Her words lodged deep, stirring both comfort and pain. He turned away, gripping the rifle tighter, afraid of what he might say if he let himself speak. Lynn's voice called from inside, sharp with warning. "Someone's coming." John shot to his feet, heart leaping. He could hear it too now, the distant rumble of hooves, heavier this time, more than before. He looked to the horizon, the night swallowing shapes that grew larger with each breath. The threat had returned, and this time it would not pass so easily. The cabin, once a prison of silence, had become a fragile haven. Now it stood on the edge of storm, and John knew that the choices he made in the hours ahead would either shatter it or forge something unbreakable. And as the riders closed in, their torches burning like hungry eyes in the darkness, he felt the old loneliness give way to something sharper, fiercer. Fear, yes, but also resolve. He was no longer alone, and that truth carried its own kind of weight. The riders came fast and loud, their torches flaring against the blackness of the night. The thunder of hooves shook the ground, a drumbeat that carried violence in every strike. John stood on the porch, rifle gripped tight, the weight of it familiar in his hands. Behind him, Ma clutched the edge of the doorframe, her eyes wide with fear, while Lynn stood ready with a knife, her jaw clenched in grim defiance. There would be no parley this time. The men had come with purpose, and that purpose was conquest. The first torch landed in the dry grass near the corral, the flames catching quickly as the horses shrieked in panic. John fired, the shot cracking through the night. One rider tumbled from his saddle, crashing hard into the date. The others shouted, spurred their mounts forward, and the siege began. Bullets tore through wood, splinters flying from the cabin walls. John ducked low, returning fire, his heart pounding with a vigor he had not felt in years. Lynn darted from the shadows, slashing at a man who dismounted too close, her blade catching flesh before she darted back into cover. Ma hauled water from the well, dousing sparks that landed on the roof, her movements frantic but steady. Each of them carried their own role in the fight, and for the first time John felt the strength of something he had thought forever lost, unity. The riders circled, firing wildly, their laughter twisted with rage. John reloaded with quick, practiced motions, every muscle in his body alive with purpose. He shouted for Ma to stay down, for Lynn to keep to the shadows, but the words fell hollow against the chaos. A torch struck the porch, flames licking upward, and John stamped it out with his boot, cursing under his breath. The leader emerged from the smoke, his grin sharp as ever, a pistol raised high. "You should have let us take what we wanted. Rancher," he bellowed. "Now we'll bone you with it." John fired again, the bullet grazing the man's shoulder, knocking him sideways. But the leader only laughed, rage fueling him as he staggered back to his feet. More torches arced through the air, striking the barn, the corral, the dry brush. Fire spread hungrily, devouring all it touched. For a moment, despair threatened to overtake John. This was his land, his refuge, the last remnant of his family. Now it burned before his eyes, and he wondered if fate had only brought these women to him so he might watch them die as well. The grief surged, threatening to paralyze him. Then Mai's voice cut through the roar of flames. "John," she cried, her tone fierce, commanding, "you are not dead yet." The word struck him like a jolt of lightning. He was alive. They were alive. And so long as that remained true, surrender was not an option. He rose from cover, rifle steady, and fought with a fury he had long buried. Each shot found its mark, each breath fueled by more than survival. It was fueled by the need to protect, to preserve, to defy the emptiness that had consumed him for years. Lynn moved with lethal precision, her knife flashing in and out of shadows, striking when least expected. She fought like one who had spent her whole life carving a place in a world determined to cast her out. Her defiance was a weapon, her will unbreakable. Mai, though not trained for violence, carried buckets of water, dragged smoldering beams away from the cabin, her courage no less than the others. Together, they made the cabin a fortress, their bond forged in the crucible of fire and blood. But the odds pressed heavier with each passing moment. The riders were many, and though they fell, more circled like vultures. John's rifle grew hot in his hands, his ammunition dwindling. The flames edged closer, smoke choking the air. He coughed, eyes burning, yet refused to yield. Then, through the chaos, another sound emerged, a cry, fierce and guttural, carried on the wind. An arrow sliced through the night, striking one of the riders squarely in the chest. Another followed, then another, each arrow swift and sure. Out of the darkness came a figure, tall and broad, his movements fluid as water yet fierce as a storm. A warrior, his face painted in dark lines, his voice singing with every release. The attackers faltered, startled by this sudden assault. The warrior moved among them like a shadow, his blade cutting where his arrows did not. John watched in awe, a spark of hope igniting in his chest. An ally, one who had chosen this moment to reveal himself. Together, they pushed the raiders back. John's rifle barked, Lynn's blade struck true, Mai's determination never wavered, and the warrior carved through their foes with unrelenting force. The attackers, once confident in their numbers, now faltered under combined resistance. Their leader shouted for retreat, his bravado shattered. With curses and threats, the survivors fled into the night, leaving behind their dead and dying, their torches trampled into the date. Silence fell, broken only by the crackle of fire and the ragged breaths of those who remained. The warrior stood tall, his eyes scanning the horizon until he was certain the threat had passed. Only then did he lower his bow, turning to face John. No words passed between them, only a nod, a silent acknowledgment of shared battle, of trust earned not by speech but by blood. The cabin smoldered, its roof scarred, its walls scorched, but it still stood. John sank onto the porch steps, exhaustion crashing over him. Mai knelt beside him, her hand brushing the soot from his cheek, her eyes filled with relief and sorrow all at once. Lynn leaned against the doorway, her knife still in hand, her shoulders trembling though her face remained composed. The warrior lingered at the edge of the firelight, a figure both present and distant. He had come when they needed him most, and though he said nothing, his presence carried weight. John felt gratitude burn within him, though he knew this man would not stay. He belonged to the land, not to walls or cabins. In the days that followed, they rebuilt what they could. The corral was little more than ash, the barn half gone, yet the cabin still offered shelter. They worked side by side, their bond deepened by what they had endured. The warrior vanished with the dawn, leaving no trail, no farewell, only the memory of his intervention. John did not mourn his absence. He understood that some allies were meant only for moments, their presence a gift not to be bound. As the land settled into uneasy quiet, John found himself standing beside my more often. Their hands brushed while hauling water, their shoulders touched while repairing beams. He felt the old guilt stirring, the shadow of Clara and Emily whispering that he had no right to feel alive again. Yet Mai's presence warmed him in ways he could not deny. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, Mai spoke softly. "I thought we would die that night, but we lived. You lived. Perhaps that means something." He met her gaze, torn between longing and sorrow. "It means I failed once, but I won't again." Her hand touched his, light as a feather. "It means you still have a heart to give, if you choose." The words lodged in him, heavy with truth. He wanted to take her hand fully, to confess the stirrings inside him, yet Lynn's watchful eyes lingered, a reminder that nothing came without cost. Mai and Lynn were bound together by more than blood, by survival, and John knew they could not remain here forever. The land was cruel, the hostility of others certain to return. The choice weighed on him. Stay with the ghost of his past, tied to the ashes of his ranch, or follow the uncertain road with the women who had brought life back into his hollow chest. The answer came quietly, almost cruelly. One morning, Lynn announced they must move on. The danger had grown too great. Staying would only invite more violence. Mai's eyes glistened, but she did not argue. She understood. John stood at the threshold of the cabin, his heart breaking in silence. Mai approached, her hands trembling as she reached for his. "I will not forget you," she whispered. "You showed me kindness when no one else would. That will stay with me, even if I must leave." He wanted to beg her to stay, to abandon reason for the pull in his chest. But he could not. He had seen what happened when one clung too tightly to what the world refused to grant. Instead, he pressed her hand to his lips, a gesture both farewell and confession. Lynn led the horses from the ashes of the corral. Mai mounted slowly, her eyes lingering on John until the distance carried her gaze away. He stood there long after they vanished from sight, the wind cold against his face, his heart torn but strangely steady. The cabin loomed behind him, scarred but standing, much like himself. He turned to it, to the work that remained, to the land that had taken everything yet left him alive. He was alone again, but not as before. Something within him had shifted, a spark rekindled by strangers who had passed through his solitude. As dawn broke the next day, he stood on the porch with his rifle across his lap, watching the horizon. The loneliness remained, but so did the memory of what had been shared, and for the first time in years, it did not feel like a curse. It felt like a burden he could carry. And though the wind howled across the plains, it no longer sounded like emptiness. It sounded like possibility. The story might end there, with a man alone but less broken, with love found and lost in the same breath. Yet in endings lay beginnings, and somewhere beyond the horizon rode two women who had changed him forever. So when you think of John Avery, remember this. Not every battle ends in triumph, and not every love stays to grow. But sometimes, even the briefest light is enough to guide a man out of the darkness. If this story spoke to you, if you felt the weight of his solitude, the fire of his struggle, the tenderness of his bond, then linger a moment. Share your thoughts, your feelings, in the space below. And if you would walk with us again through stories of hardship and hope, remember to like, to subscribe, and to return. For out here on the frontier of memory and tale, there are always more reckonings to come, and always another choice waiting just beyond the horizon.